Why does there seem to be at least two tandem Passovers, or Passover days, in the New Testament? One also known as, aka, the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper that our Messiah had with his Talmudim. And then there's this Second Temple Jewish Passover, the next day in the afternoon while he was dying for us. Did Yeshua observe a different calendar, Passover system? Or was there an actual calendar controversy with the timing of Passover at that time? Or maybe the correct Passover, the appointed timing, is at the beginning of the 14th, and somehow all the Second Temple and the Jewish leaders at that time were all wrong on the timing. As a lot of the churches of God, the Sabbatarian churches of God, have taught, especially from Herbert Armstrong in the 20th century, and as I was taught and believed for decades. Why are there no women or children at that last meal that he had with his disciples? Why is it just his Talmudim? Passovers always include women and children, families, whenever possible. And it was definitely possible. We know that Yeshua had his mother there witnessing his death, his crucifixion. And then there was the woman who first saw him risen, and the other Mary. So women were definitely involved, but why weren't they at the last meal? That's a good question I asked a few years ago and began researching. And was that year more like a men's leadership training night before the actual Passover timing? Is that a possibility? And I've heard that from a Messianic rabbi, and I've heard that in Judaism back then, the night before the actual Passover, the senior rabbis would have a training and go through with the graduating rabbis. And I haven't found much historical information to back that up, but we see in modern Judaism, they have Orthodox Judaism. They'll do two Passovers, 2 days in a row. In the diaspora, in the land of Israel, they don't do that today, generally speaking at least. But out in the diaspora, they do it. And so why are there all these differences? In other words, should Passover every year begin at the beginning of the 14th of Aviv, or Nisan, if you want to use that name, as we see in Scripture as well, Nisan, Aviv, or in the afternoon? Should it be in the afternoon, closer to the evening, the sunset of the 14th, overlapping? The meal would overlap into the 15th, of course, as we see that the Jewish people have been doing for over 2,000 years. But, well, as we study this a little bit more, we can see that the understanding, to understand the New Testament, we can understand more with Jewish lenses, as we say, lenses metaphorically speaking, having a connection with the Jewish people at least. As Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1 and in verse 16, he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Right? And then he ends that verse with, "For the Jew first." The gospel is for the Jew first and also for the Greek. Or the non-Jew, as it can also be translated. What Christianity has taught is that, well, the Jews rejected the gospel, their history, so to speak, and so now the Gentiles can understand it better because we've accepted the Messiah. And so there's this replacement theology that the Catholics started teaching early on, and the Protestant Church Fathers have continued this replacement theology idea when they even interpret Romans chapter 1, verse 16. But what I propose is that not all the Jews rejected the gospel. Okay, we've got all the original apostles, every one of them. was a Jew. There's Nicodemus, there's Joseph, I can go on, right? Therefore, are they no longer needed? I don't take that conclusion. Or in other words, did Paul teach a replacement theology? And I don't see any replacement theology as you see that used in Christianity, more of the modern centuries of Christianity. And what I propose is that's been like a self-inflicted wound that carries baggage with it. Anyone who's grown up in Christianity, who's been in the churches, have this influence to one degree or another. And there's a number of self-inflicted wounds that Christianity has had, anti-Torah, and other doctrines out there, of course. But replacement theology is one of them. Which leads to the title of this topic, getting back to this topic. And I'll start sharing my screen. Titling this message, Two-Tandem NT Passovers. And notice I put a question mark there at the end. Are there two tandem ones that we see in the last 24 hours of the Messiah's life in the flesh? And NT standing for New Testament, in case you didn't know. So is there a calendar controversy, a disagreement between the Messiah and his Talmudim and the leadership of the Second Temple, or are there simply misunderstandings today in much of Christianity that has come to embrace the Torah, the biblical feast days? And this is what I'm going to get to, and according to my current understanding. First of all, when cultural biblical feast keepers ask, for example, where are you keeping the feast this year? Okay, the word feast. What does that mean, right? Is it the spring feast? Is it the fall feast? A lot of times in the culture I grew up with, it would be referring to the fall feast. Where are you keeping the feast this year? Depending on the context, you might be talking about Passover, yes. Passover. Well, if you're talking about Passover, where are you keeping for the feast? And our brother Pat said, I'm going to go keep the feast next week, and he's going to go up into Oregon. Now, that question often includes more than one day. Have you noticed that? That one word feast can be ambiguous of and by itself, depending on the culture of believers you're attending and observing with. Passover is commanded on one day only, right? The 14th day of Aviv, or Nisan, as we see in some of the Tanakh books as well, including Nehemiah. But it's not limited to that one day. If someone says, where are you keeping the Passover? Well, Passover can also include the first day of Matzah, a Shabbaton, or also known as an annual Sabbath or a rest day. And that can include 2 days if you say where you're going to keep the Passover, because usually you're going to keep it in the same place. They're a couple days kind of connected there together, the 14th and the 15th day of the first month. Now, Passover can also mean the 7th day if you're staying in the same area, or if you're traveling, it may not. Passover can refer to the 1st and 7th days if people are just observing the 1st and 7th days, as well as the 14th. So it could be including 3 days altogether. Where are you keeping the Passover this year? It can be referred to 3 days, or even it could be including all 7 days of matzot. Matzah is the singular term for unleavened bread, or matzot, plural. Where are you going to keep these 7 days? Plus there's that 8th day, if you want to talk about the Passover day on the 14th, we see that there's 8 days total. Someone might be observing Passover. So Passover can refer to all 8-day period. Also, I didn't put this in my notes, but it says to meet on 3 times of the year, to keep these feasts 3 times a year. All the males come before you, before the Most High, and give an offering. We see that in the Torah. But there's 7 annual Shabbatons. So it's not just, so 3 can mean 7, 3 can mean, more than that, and depending on the context and what it's talking about. The Feast of Sukkot, or we also say Tabernacles in English, is 7 days only. But if someone says, where are you going to go for tabernacles, the feast, it could be referring to all 8 days due to the final Shabbaton. That's the holy day connected to the tail end of Sukkot. So we have this mirror image, right? With Pesach, you have 1 day before the 7 days, and then with Sukkot, you have a mirror image with 7 days followed by 1 day, and not all of them are Shabbatons in terms of rest days and Sabbaths. Like the 14th day isn't considered a Shabbaton; it's the 15th, and then the 7th day after that as well. So limited terminology can be confusing to beginning biblical feast goers or feast keepers, but not for the more experienced ones, right? Knowing the culture, the context. Most of us are in this 20th century, 21st century now. Context and the culture, how we understand these words and how many days we're talking about is based upon our human experiences. But how much is it really taken from historical, ancient evidence? Well, such is a key for the New Testament Passover truth seekers. And so I wanted this to be very important groundwork, this foundation for this topic that I'm going to get into. As limited feast, I put that in quotes, feast terminology can be confusing to beginning biblical feast keepers, but not for the much more experienced ones who catch the cultural context better that we're talking about. So Passover, Shavuot, or Pentecost is the Greek word for counting 50 on the 50th day. And then there's the Sukkot, like I mentioned earlier, those 3 time periods of the year. But we have more than one Shabbaton, or more than 3 within those 3 time periods. So is this New Testament Passover topic that I'm diving into for those who are not Jewish? It is. That's why I'm saying this topic is important. Understanding this foundational groundwork that I'm laying for those who are not Jewish, who did not grow up in a Jewish home, or still have what I propose, and please don't get offended out there, I'm just saying this, unconscious. I've been guilty of this. You know, you hear the old saying, you know one, it takes one to know one. I've been guilty of this. I've had unconscious Christian, we're better than the Jews, you know, baggage, I call it. You know, Christian baggage from former church backgrounds because of this replacement theology. Even though if you would have asked me when I had it, I would say, no way, I'm not anti-Semitic, I don't have this Christian baggage, I just want to know the truth. But deep down, when I struggled with this topic that I'm proposing today, I had to realize that, yes, you know, I want to make sure I don't have any of that baggage. I want to understand the truth and really look at the words. And words mean things. Words are so important. And when they can be translated in a number of different ways, we call them homonyms and heteronyms, and words can be interpreted logically and possibly in multiple ways. It becomes difficult. You know, and as Christians begin observing the truly biblical feasts, they soon learn that, well, just one feast word or title alone can refer to 1, 2, or 3, or up to even 8 full days, or partial days, for that matter. And the same concept must be understood, though, and remembered regarding the New Testament, including when Yeshua's Talmudim, his disciples, asked him where they should prepare and eat the Passover. Now, there's many verses in the 4 Gospels. I'm not going to, of course, take too long to go to each one of them, but I'm going to hit the key ones here, and this is important. You're going to see what did they mean when they said prepare and eat the Passover. I think I have a new nugget of information for some of you out there, and as this is recording and being heard by others in cyberspace through YouTube. For example, let's go to Matthew 26, verse 17. I'm quoting from the New King James Version, unless otherwise stated. It says here, and I did not put my own italics in here. I did put some bolding here because I want to hone in on some key words and phrases here. It says, now on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yeshua, aka Jesus, saying to him, where do you want us to prepare to eat the Passover? Now wait a second. How could they be saying that on the first day, right? This troubled me years ago. Decades ago. And then I realized, well, they still didn't believe that he was going to die. He gave them a number of predictions that he was going to die. They still had they remembered it after the Mass, but they didn't believe it at the time. No way. And so they're asking him, where do you want us to prepare and to eat the Passover? And how could they ask this on the first day, right, of unleavened bread, when Passover is always the day before, right? When the Passover begins the day before. Now, italics. One thing that's good about the King James Version is they put italics in there. And what that means, when you see italics in the King James and in the New King James, is that translators, they confess to adding such words as not found in the original Greek manuscripts that they were translating from, right? If they're taking it from the Byzantine text or the Vulgate translations, whatever they're taking it from, when they add their own words, because they're translating the meaning, not the literal words, they'll plug in words in there. So we got to realize that King James put that italics you see there at the beginning of that verse as day of the feast. You won't find that in the original Greek manuscripts, at least the ones that they were using. Therefore, how about if we take out the confessed added italics words? Let's relook at this verse to get a clearer view of it. And here it is. Now on the first, and of course conjunction words are kind of plugged in there too, but sometimes not. Like the Hebrew word for the is the letter He, right? Ha, Mashiach means the Messiah. So sometimes the word the is in there, but sometimes not. So let's look at it again, and then we'll get to questions. Now on the first of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yeshua and saying to him, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? Of course, they didn't really believe he was going to die, so they're asking him this question. Some people say, well, he had to eat it with them because they asked him that question. Well, not necessarily. Now, let's get back to the Torah here, because it does say in the Torah, in Exodus, in Shemot, chapter 12, verse 3, it says, on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb according to a household. So notice this, the 10th day is when this preparation begins. And what I propose is, because we're not doing that anymore, because there's no temple, it's not in our culture in the 20th century or the 21st century. But how about 2,000 years ago when they were doing this? The Feast of Matzot may have culturally included preparation days also. So, yeah, just as Passover can be 1 day, 2 days, 3 days in our culture today, or even all 8 days, maybe 2,000 years ago it included those 4 days beforehand preparing. And where are you going to keep this feast? Well, yeah, if you're going to do it, you're going to have to travel and get there, as Yeshua did when he was 12. And in Luke chapter 2, it says every year they went to the feast for Passover, and according to the temple's reckoning of these holy days. And so what I propose is that if you take a literal interpretation with our modern understanding and cultural views of Matthew 26, verse 17, it sounds like a serious contradiction. The New Testament's got some serious flaws, but with the understanding that this terminology can be referred to the preparation 4 days beforehand also, then it makes sense. It's the only logical way that I can see this section of verse here be compliant with the rest of the Bible and with the Torah. Now, do we have a comment? I saw Mark Edward raise his hand. Did you? Oh, that's Matthew. Again, that's Matthew chapter 26, verse 17. And you might want to go there if you're following along, because I'm going to continue on there. Continue on after that verse. Context, right? It's important. Verse 18, and he, referring to Yeshua, Messiah, said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover. Now notice I put in there with a little commentary, my commentary, at least part of the 14th day. It doesn't say, you know, we could say, just like the word Passover can really refer to more than one day. Could be, what I propose, it could be the preparation days, right? The 4 days beforehand, as well as at least part of the 14 he's got to do with his Talmudim. He can't do it while he's up there being nailed through his hands and feet. Can't be doing it then. So at the end of the 14th, in the afternoon of the 14th, so at least the partial of it. And so there's different ways to, you know, to look at this, and that's all I'm proposing. I'm not trying to be overly dogmatic, but just giving you my perspective, which brings unity to everything. As he says, I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. Now remember, Exodus 12:3, the preparation days included, you know, from the 10th day onward. This is where they're getting the animal. And he says, go and ask for this animal in one verse, and they'll just give it to you, right? We know that miracle, and that happens, and the room is given to them. All these miracles happen. And what I propose is that these things were happening, you know, on the 9th day and the 10th day, and so there's this time period going on that we're not given all the details in scriptures like we would like. So those who know the Torah more, and then those who are more Jewish in their background and their upbringing, are going to have a little more comprehension of this possibility, perhaps. But verse 19, it says, so the disciples did as Yeshua had directed them. And they prepared. Notice this, the key word I bolded there, prepared the Passover. Verse 20, when evening had come. Now notice it does not say Passover, when the Passover meal had come, or there's no mention of any lambs even dying yet. You know, that's an assumption, and it theoretically possible assumption, but I wouldn't be overly dogmatic. When you're looking at this, they're preparing the Passover, verse 19, and then an evening comes. It doesn't say what evening. There's no explicit information. It's a little ambiguous. Let me put it that way, not to be dogmatic about it. And so it says he sat down with the 12, verse 21. Now as they were eating, and then again it doesn't say Passover, or they were eating some lamb, or anything about animal or anything, right? He says, and they were eating, and he said, assuredly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. So they're eating a meal here. Verse 26, and as they were eating, Yeshua took bread. And notice it doesn't say unleavened bread. There's not the Greek word there. It's a different Greek word for bread versus unleavened bread, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And he blessed it, and he gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. Now, I wouldn't say it was leavened bread, or it had to be leavened bread, because as you're getting close to that first day of unleavened bread, you want to start getting everything out. So chances are it was unleavened, especially if it's going to be symbolic of his body. It, you know, sinless, unleavened is most likely what it was. But if the author and the inspirer of the scripture wanted to make a statement that this was the Passover meal, what I propose is the word would have put unleavened bread, or like the Hebrew word is matzah, but we don't see it. It just says he took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And of course, unleavened bread is without leavening, and leavening is symbolic of sin and bondage and slavery in Egypt, modern world, sinful ways, wrong ways, of course, all and so forth. But notice, no words for lamb or matzah or unleavened bread ever included in the context of New Testament, what's also known as the Last Supper, or Lord's Supper, or last meal, his last meal. When you look at all these scriptures in all the four Gospels, none of them include lamb with his last meal. None of them include unleavened bread to make it clear that this was the actual Passover timing. If there was, it would be an easy slam dunk case for the churches of God, since the 20th century, who've been teaching it that way, and who've, I learned it that way originally. So how about the Gospels of Mark and Luke? Okay, let's look at them a little bit. Well, if you go to Mark chapter 14, verses 12 and onward, you see the verses are very similar to Matthew. So I'm not going to revisit that area. It's very similar as Matthew chapter 26 that I went to. Luke 22 words similarly enough until we get to verses 14 through 16. Luke, we have to remember, Luke was a physician. He was more educated than most of the apostles other than Paul. In fact, he wrote more of the New Testament than Paul. Did you know that? If you look at the words, the amount of pages of the New Testament, he didn't write more books. Paul's got the victory on most books. But Luke, because the book of Acts and the book of Luke they're big books, they override all of Paul's epistles put together, even if you include Hebrews, which is interesting. Not just a little trivia there for you out there. Luke, notice what he includes here in verses 14 through 16. When the hour had come. Okay, what does he mean by the hour? Is he talking about the time of suffering and testing, the betrayal, suffering, and testing, or to kill the lamb? Is he talking about, okay, and when the hour had come to kill the lamb, or the Passover meal? Is he talking about, okay, these are assumptions that are easy to draw. We need more information to conclude which is it of the two. It says he sat down and the 12 apostles with him. Or if you like the word emissaries, that's the way some people prefer emissaries. Now, verse 15, it says, then he said to them, referring to Yeshua, Messiah, with fervent desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Now, I put the word coming Passover because was he referring to the Passover present tense, that they were doing the Passover as he was speaking, or is he referring to the Passover on the next day, that he would like to keep it with them when everyone's killing the lamb at the temple and so forth? Notice verse 16, for I say to you, I will no longer eat of it, referring to the Passover meal, until, and notice I put there, as he did with them the previous 3.5 years, or however long you think his ministry was. He was doing the Passover with them in previous years. He says, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom. So he's basically saying, I'm not going to eat it with you again. I'm not going to eat the Passover until it's fulfilled in the kingdom. So was he simply predicting his death again to occur during the actual Passover timing the next day, while he would be dying and eventually dead in the afternoon when those animals are dead as well? At the same timing with the temple Passover lambs. Was he predicting that? That's one way of looking at it that I was not taught growing up. And since 1975, since I was being brought to the churches I grew up in and were observing Passover, and then the night to be much remembered. So was he predicting this? Even though his Talmudim, remember, they still did not believe that he would die. So here he's giving them another hint. What I propose is that, hey, I'm no longer going to eat this Passover, guys. They're all thinking, hey, we're doing this tomorrow night. What do you mean you're not going to? They just weren't getting it yet. As many times as he told them and warned them. Let's look at some important context facts to consider. No New Testament corrections, rebuke, or in the Gospels, the 4 Gospels or the book of Acts, recorded disagreements with the timing of the temple Passover lamb sacrifices. There's no disagreements. There's all this rebuke about tzitzits being too long and praying in public, and yeah, you should be tithing and on mint and these little tiny things and the weightier matters you're not doing, and hypocrisy. He called them on the carpet. There's no correction. This is what I propose is a fact. If you can find a correction where he said, hey guys, you got the timing of the Passover is wrong. We shouldn't be killing the lambs. You guys shouldn't be doing it. You're doing it. You've adopted some pagan system of the past in your baggage of bondage with the Babylonians or the Persians or whoever. There's no correction of that. You could have said, hey guys, the temple, the scribes, you could have said that the scribes and Pharisees, that the holy timing is just a little wrong. There's not even a hint of it. Point number 2 is there's no Passover meal key identifier words included with the context of his final meal. Now, I won't say Last Supper or Lord's Supper, because that creates a hot word, a buzzword for people, and they get a little emotional because Catholics and Protestants have used it, and they use it, and you see the painting of the Last Supper and so forth with long hair and looking like hippies or women, or or at least they make Jesus look that way. Nevertheless, his final meal with his Talmudim, his disciples, you'd think that such important words like unleavened or lamb or even bitter herbs would be mentioned in his last meal with them. But we don't see any of these key identifier words. If there was, it would be an easy open and shut, closed case, right? No women, again, like I said. Why is there no women or children present during the final meal time period, such as his own mother, who witnessed his crucifixion, and also the first one to see him risen from the dead, the other Mary, was it Mary Magdalene? Very important women in the faith. Why weren't they there? Is the Passover not for women? Should we exclude women from Passover? Well, some people might draw that conclusion because of that example. I don't know anyone who does. But we know that the Passover was always a family event, and it was for teaching the children. And so why is he just with his Talmudim? That is, to me, a very important fact to consider. Okay? Loving by itself may not be much, right? Any of these 3 points. But if all 3 points above are not good enough combined together, then perhaps nothing is. But I'll keep continuing this topic for those who are, still want to be like the Bereans, who are not too set in their ways and willing to test everything and to not be too naive or gullible to me. Don't just believe me, right? But believe your own Bible and believe what you can prove in history that is compliant with the Bible, not in disagreement with the Bible. And yet still, we want to be humble. If you're humble and open to change when the most accurate information is presented, then I appreciate your patience in continuing to listen to this, and with an open mind and an open heart, again, not to be naive or gullible or to compromise with anything against you believe in your conscience according to your faith. But what I propose here in this next slide is the Gospel of John clears this up. He clears this up better than the other Gospels. Now, John chapters 18 and 19 are explicit. As far as I know, nobody disagrees regarding the actual timing of his crucifixion unto death to be at the same timing as the killing and the sacrifices of the second temple Passover lambs. Everyone agrees, as far as I know, the churches of God and others in this point right here. But there's disagreements about the temple calendar. Right, that's where the conspiracies and the theories and the disagreements come, because of their understanding of the New Testament or their understanding of what they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some people other different calendar issues, and not this issue specifically. But, again, let me just remind, there's no correction or rebuke in any of the four Gospels regarding the Moedim calendar controversies about when Passover sacrifices, when a year begins, when a month begins, when the 14th day was, and other Moedim. They all occurred back then in agreement with the Sanhedrin. And other than the counting of the Omer to Pentecost, according to the Talmud and a lot of Jewish history, that the Pharisees counted the beginning of the 50 differently than the Sadducees. And so they've kept a lot of good history over the last 2,000 years in this regard, but we don't see any disagreements on these other issues within Judaism. Second Temple leadership. And it's even more explicit. Now let's go back to John chapter 13, knowing that chapters 18 and 19 are explicit. Everybody agrees. Now notice in verse 1 he says, now before the feast of the Passover. Right? This is before the 14th day even begins. When, I bolded that word too, when Yeshua, a.k.a. Jesus, knew that his hour had come. Now, remembering what I mentioned back in Luke chapter 22 through verse 14, remember he said, and the hour has come, and he's with his last meal, that he should depart from this world to the Father. So he's talking about this, the hour had come. My understanding is it's talking about that full 14th day, from betrayal by the betrayer, Judas, to the stripes. By his stripes were healed, the fulfillment of Isaiah 53, and the death. Not just the death of the lambs, but his hour of testing and trial and everything from the betrayal going onward. John chapter 13, it says before the feast of the Passover. Then notice also in the same chapter, John 13, we see foot washing come into the picture. And we see this Last Supper or last meal and these new covenant symbolisms that are not recorded in the Torah, in the books of Moses to do during Passover. And then we see, Judas takes bread in verses 18, when you continue on there, verses 18 through 30, but does not say unleavened bread again. Maybe there was some leavening there, and Yeshua might have given him some leavening, which would have been symbolic of sin, his betrayal, the rejection. And it says, Hasatan entered him as he took that bread. It doesn't say matzah, or any Greek or Hebrew word isn't used in the context there for unleavened bread. So again, ambiguous, right? I can't say it's unleavened bread. I can't say it's not unleavened bread. But it's interesting that the explicit word for unleavened bread is not used there in the Greek manuscripts that have been recorded and preserved. So why does Paul use the Lord's Supper? He uses this title. He doesn't say Passover in 1 Corinthians, in the book of Corinthians. So let's take a look at that, because if it was the Passover, he doesn't use that terminology. As it is written in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 18 through 21, he says, for, first of all, when you come together as a church, that Greek word is ecclesia. It's not talking about homes, like Passovers are kept in the homes. He's talking about a gathering. It could be in homes, it could be in a synagogue, or it could be just a place of gathering for the group of people, not an actual building. It doesn't have to be a building. He says, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For verse 19, there must be also factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized or identified among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, he says, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. A lot of people just kind of stop right there and say, see, it's not called the Lord's Supper. We shouldn't call it the Lord's Supper. Paul is making a statement that the Lord's Supper is a bad title for it. But what I propose is is a different perspective. Verse 21, he says, "For eating, each one takes his own supper." Now again, it's not Passover. That Greek word, Strong's number 1173, is dipianon, however you want to pronounce that, the word for dinner. Eats his own supper or dinner ahead of others. One is hungry and the other is drunk. So you look at the context here, Paul is rebuking them for what they were supposed to be doing faithfully as a good anniversary, but not as a worldly party, as drinking too much and getting drunk, or with any selfish hunger and patience. As you go to a Jewish Seder, or you go to even the beginning of Shabbat, and all these traditions, if you're hungry, oh boy, it's hard to wait, to start eating, because there's so many traditions, right? And so I'm not proposing that there's a lot of traditions here, but simply, they were just being selfish and glutton and not taking turns and probably cutting in front of others and whatever they were doing. It was just simply, Paul's rebuking them for doing it in proper manner. Not that, observing the Lord's Supper is a wrong title or a wrong way to word it. So verse 23, he says, "For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord," referring to Yeshua, "on the same night which he was betrayed, took bread." And so he's making a hint here that it seems like they're doing this at the beginning of the 14th day, that they're still doing this. Why would they? If the Passover is truly on the next day in the afternoon, why would Paul be doing this? Why would the Corinthians be doing this? This is a paradox. This is a problem that many have in trying to understand this context. And so hopefully I have some new information for you. Again, notice he does not utilize the words Passover or unleavened in the verses or context, but simply the Lord's Supper and bread. What I'm going to propose to you before I explain that a little bit more is some compliant ancient Galilean Jewish history here to understand this context a little bit better, potentially. In the Mishnah, and I'm not saying the Mishnah is holy scripture and everything's right about it, but I use it as historical information to understand what was going on at those time periods. And if it's compliant with scripture, I chew the meat. If it doesn't, I spit out the bones. So just to let you know, before I start talking, that the Mishnah is a non-Christian, non-biased historical information offering us 1,800 years historical evidence, because it wasn't being written, didn't start getting written until about 200 CE or AD, to show that there were Galilean Jews. This is a record in the Mishnah that Galilean Jews, and we've got to remember Yeshua and his Talmudim were also Galilean Jews, for that matter, a little side information, but they had adopted a tradition titled Sudah Mafsechet, and however you like to pronounce the Hebrew vowels in there, but that's a transliteration there in my presentation, which is literally translated as Last Supper. So remember that the Mishnah was written by survivors of the temple destruction. They escaped to Galilee as the Romans tried to assassinate, execute. They didn't want another Maccabean revolt. Remember, 200 years, the Maccabees revolt, and they regained Jerusalem. Well, the Romans had learned their lesson. Okay, we got to wipe out the Sanhedrin. No survivors, no witnesses. We don't want people to think that they can do this again like the Maccabees did. So they did all they could to wipe them out. But of course, our Creator had other plans. The Romans didn't accomplish their goal completely. And some survivors got to Galilee. And this is where the Mishnah was written, beginning about 200. And so that's why I call it 1,800-year-old historical evidence, that there were Galilean Jews observing a Last Supper at the beginning of the 14th on the first month of every year, according to the biblical calendar, of course, not the Roman calendar, Julian calendar, although the Babylonian calendar was in agreement at that time. They used Babylonian month names. Nevertheless, over 1,800 years ago, Galilean Jews had established this additional tradition on the 14th of Aviv, beginning the day of the Passover, called Seudah Masechet, meaning Last Supper. But there is no historical evidence that the Judean Jews observed it. These are the Jews who were of Jerusalem, and the writers of the Mishnah, of course. They're kind of like, they get to the Galilee, and for 130 years after the destruction of the temple, they're trying to survive. They're trying to keep their women and children from dying and being captured, and who knows, to say the least, what else happens in those kind of situations. And finally, they get to where they can start writing again and recording what had been passed on, and there's been some lost information in those 130 years in regard to the calendar, yes, but they recorded as much as they could pass on accurately and how much the Father wanted them to record, and not all of it's good. I'm not saying it's all right. It's the oral law, a lot of the strict do's and don'ts that the Messiah and even the Apostle Paul rebuked, that it was too strict and so forth. So they started writing down the oral law, and that's also known as the Mishnah. Here they say halakha, the beginning writings of that. So what I propose, though, maybe the Galilean Jews, maybe some of them had accepted Yeshua. Maybe there was some influence that was coming from the believers in Yeshua, and that we don't know. There's a lot of theories in that you'll find if you really study and research. I'll give you some sources in a minute here. But before I do, this Mishnah Pesachim, Pesach is the Hebrew word for Passover, Pesach. And so the I am is the plural. This in the Mishnah Pesachim, you see this Last Supper tradition was about remembering that it was not all Hebrews who were in danger of death at Yah's hand in Egypt, but only the firstborn. So this Last Supper was about the firstborn. So a special meal was adopted, according to the records, whereby the meal would be eaten, and then there would be a temporary fast to follow that for the firstborn. Thus it became the name translated as the Last Supper. That's according to Mishnah. Their reasoning after 130 years, wondering why these Galilean Jews, and getting whatever reports they could as they're recording this information. But the next meal that these Galilean Jews were doing was eating the Passover. And this is what they record. Now, research. If you want to research the Galilean Last Supper evidence, you can simply Google search Mishnah Galilean Last Supper or Origins of the Last Supper. And you'll get a number of links, of course. But however, the top search results, you can use different wording than I did there, as I did as well. I tried a number of different wordings to try to get to the bottom of this with some searching historical evidence. But the top search results do not list their historical evidence sources as true scholars should. I was a little disappointed okay, where in the Pesachim, in the Mishnah, which chapters? There's a number of chapters, and then there's paragraphs that you can put verse numbers to, and so forth. But what you'll find when you try to research is that they don't let us know exactly where. Why? Well, to prove this for yourself, as they have, from their websites, you'll see that they have other teachings that are false. Some of them teach a Friday crucifixion. Some teach, this or that. So that, we really must check up and test all things that seem scholarly. Really nice websites, beautifully put together, and seem so credible. And they even have the name Torah school or teaching and all this, and they know Hebrew really well, and so forth. But not everything ministries teach are wrong. I'm not saying that everything that those websites are wrong just because they believe in a Friday crucifixion or they believe in this or that that's different than I agree. Like I said, I chew the meat, spit out the bones, and I look at information. So some of you might know Herb Solinsky. He's a true elite scholar. Still alive today. I consider him the best in the world. I can't imagine anybody who's studied Jewish history and the Talmud and the calendar for over 50 years, since 1967. He's been studying just the biblical calendar topics on every topic. If there's a topic I don't have information on or study yet, I ask him, and it's like, wow, I can't believe where does he get this? You know, he's traveled to all these yeshiva schools around the country and even top university libraries and gathered a lot of information. He always does list, if you look at any of his writings, he always lists his historical evidence from exactly where and evaluates such accurately, as far as I've been able to see so far. He gives accurate evaluations, whether it be Josephus or Philo or, like I said, other issues like this, to make it as easy as possible for others to find it, to check up on him. Therefore, I sent him an email about this recently, and also because he has read and knows the Mishnah and the Talmuds, you know, Jewish history so much more than me, and what I assume is probably more than 99.9% of the others out there that are even teaching on this topic, or such topics as the calendar. But, you know, currently he's too busy, you know, preparing for the feast days and taxes and teachings, and he's got a real busy life. Even in his 70s, amazing guy, brilliant. Still, mind is intact and sharp. So Herb's quick email, though, he did give me a quick email reply, and here I quote it for you, okay? Jumping into it, he says, much has been written, you know, referring to the Mishnah, the Galilean Jews, the Last Supper. He says, much has been written about this, and there are several competing theories. I have about 1,500 pages of photocopies about this and that I have collected since about 1980. Just on, you know, I guess he's referring to this Galilean Jews and the Last Supper and what's in the Mishnah. Like I said, how many of you have collected 1,500 pages in photocopies? If you get to know Herb, you know, most people would consider him the biggest. He would win a Bookworm of the Year award, or he's one of these, what many calls a library nerd. He'll go to the library every chance he gets, or go to one he hasn't been to before to get information. Like I said, he'll travel the country, and I use that in a complimentary way. I don't have time to go out there and do all he has done. So, you know, when he's got information that matches Scripture, I consider it very valuable, and I consider his opinion and his evaluation of what he's read very valuable. Notice here, and I'm not saying I agree 100% with him on everything, okay? I think outside the box. I'm, you know, like you out there, hopefully. Anyway, but he says here, continuing his email, but there is no time for this now, and people who have a strong opinion are not easily persuaded to change their mind. Yeah, and I put in caps there, you know, they're too stubborn. And of course, you know, he's had hard time dealing with people understanding this topic, and so he's kind of warning me out there, as he often does, that people are pretty stubborn even though the information's there. He's got a lot on it if you're open-minded and humble enough to hear his perspective and views on it as well as mine. So moving on to the next slide here, the New Testament confusion. I call it New Testament confusion out of Jewish context and culture. If you're trying to understand this topic without the Jewish people, without Jewish culture, especially ancient culture, not so much modern Judaism, which has changed a lot. And people try to say Judaism today is the same as 2,000 years ago. No, it's polarized to be as much different from Christianity, and Christianity is polarized the other direction. They haven't liked each other, in case you didn't know, over the last 1,700 years especially, or 2,000 years for that matter. Nevertheless, for different reasons in different centuries, but we're trying to understand this New Testament confusion, come out of it. And what I propose, without the Jewish people, we're incomplete. Without the Jewish people, you know, and we just write them off and say we're smarter than them, we're better than them, and have any of that, even if it's unconscious baggage in us, it's gonna be too hard for us to change. We're gonna just get too stubborn about it. And I've been guilty of that myself in the past, like I said. But let's understand this in the Jewish lenses, understanding the New Testament. First century believers, including Paul, Shaul, were still involved with Jerusalem temple sacrificial system, even up until its destruction in 70 CE. And not only do the good historians admit this, but it's right there in the book of Acts. You go to Acts 18:18. You see the provisions which look like a Nazirite vow, Paul taking, and the shaving of the hair, and taking sacrifice, being part of the temple offerings and sacrificial system in chapter 21, and also go to chapter 24. If you go to chapter 21, it's verses 20 through 26. They make Shaul take a vow that he will not teach against Moses, even in regard to circumcision. And he does it, and pays for 4 other people who are going to take this vow, some kind of a Nazirite vow too, included with the offerings and everything. And then in 1 Corinthians, well, after you get to Acts chapter 24:17, there's a list there for you. 1 Corinthians 10, he says, hey, if you were eating of the temple, of the Jewish people, you were having communion with the Most High. Not so when you're eating of these altars of the Gentiles, you're having fellowship with demons. And he makes that pretty clear that it's okay to eat. It was pointing back to what Yeshua did for us. Just like before the crucifixion was pointing forward as an object lesson, Paul's view of it was, hey, this is pointing backwards of what he did for me. I don't have to do this to be saved. I don't have to do this, but it's a good thing. And our Creator is not limited to time. Past tense, future tense, it's all can be looked as the same to him. You see a lot of forgiveness in the Tanakh without any sacrifices. The Nineveh was forgiven, no sacrifices with Nineveh. It's repentance. And there's a scripture that says, I require obedience, not sacrifice. And so we can go to all these scriptures and we can see that the sacrificial system is not the thing that saves us or forgives us. It's a combination of things, of course. And then if you go to Revelation chapter 11, and it's very metaphoric, right? It's a metaphoric book, so I put that in a green highlight there because it says to measure those who are at the temple, and it could be referring to a physical temple or an altar. We know the daily sacrifices will start up again before the abomination of desolation in the end time, and so maybe there will be believers there supporting a daily sacrificial system for the right reasons, not to just be forgiven or that to reject the death and resurrection or the gospel in any way, but simply as Paul did in the book of Acts and the other believers with the right mindset. If it's done in the right place and it's being supported by the Most High, hey, it's not a sin to get involved with it. Nevertheless, let's move on here. I don't want to get off on a tangent on the sacrifice. I have a whole teaching called on YouTube even, Sacrificial System Necessary, with a question mark, to get into this topic more detail. But moving on here, this means, though, when we understand this correctly with Jewish culture and Jewish mindset, even of the believers in the book of Acts and the New Testament, this means that the new covenant believers were still partaking with the Passover lamb sacrifices and the meal, even until the destruction of the temple. And again, historians, I've read it, I don't have it all compiled together, but even when I majored in theology, I read it and I studied it, that historians do admit that the believers were involved with the sacrificial system. So going back to the book of Corinthians, we can understand things a little bit more, why they were doing this Last Supper anniversary. This explains why, to me, New Covenant believers would be celebrating what Paul calls it, the Lord's Supper, or some people call it the Last Supper, the last meal. It's an anniversary until the Messiah returns, the firstborn from the dead, with potential good Galilean Jewish influence. Doing this tradition, combining it with that. Who knows? I don't know when the origin started exactly with the believers, or did it start before it, but it was done in Galilee at least 200 years later. So nowhere, again, in the New Testament does the New Testament explicitly state that Yeshua's last meal was the actual Passover meal after killing a lamb. There's just no evidence of that during his final 24 hours while he was in the flesh with us. But all the evidence shows that he was dying when the Passover lambs are being killed. And so what, my belief in that regard is that his Talmudim, after he died, did go back to that same room. Very depressed. Can you imagine how sad they were? Wow, he just died, but we rented this room. Hey, wait a second. He did say he wouldn't do this with us again until the kingdom. No. They were doubting. Even when the women said, hey, we saw him. Mary said, hey, we saw him. No, they just ran to that tomb, and wasn't John the faster runner? Peter got the head start, but Yochanan was a faster runner, beat him to it. Anyway, I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but, eating lamb and unleavened bread are not found, again, just repeating this, in any context of the four Gospels regarding the last or Lord's Supper timing with his Talmudim. And you can go to Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, John 13, and 1 Corinthians 11. Again, verses 17 through 18, where he calls it the Last Supper. So I try to understand this with perfect unity. The lack of evidence can be valuable evidence. That's what I propose. As we are careful to not add or take away from Scripture. Right? I don't want to add to it. I don't want to take away from it. I'm sure you don't out there. We've got to be careful not to. Not that, as long as the words are supportive, we can believe in things that are outside the literal Scriptures as long as it's supportive evidence. And just a reminder of the Scriptures that say do not add or take. And did you know there's 5 sections in the Tanakh and 1 in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament? Deuteronomy 4:2 says, you shall not add to the word which I command you, nor take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Most High, your Elohim, which I command you. And then the next chapter, it says, therefore you shall be careful to do as the Most High, your Elohim, has commanded you. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. So it's very synonymous to not adding or taking away. Then again, Deuteronomy, Devarim chapter 12, verse 32, whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it nor take away from it. Right? We've got to be careful. And then Joshua, as we also say, Yehoshua. Only be strong and very courageous, verse 7 of chapter 1, that you may observe and do according to all the Torah. And he continues on there, not turning to the left or the right, very similar to Deuteronomy, about not adding or taking away. And so Proverbs chapter 30, here Solomon writes, and he learned through the school of hard knocks about this, every word of Yah, of Elohim, is pure. He is a shield to those who put their trust in him. Do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. Whew. Yeah, we got to be careful about adding words. We don't want to be teaching wrong things or to be misrepresenting the truth in any way. So we have to be careful with dogma and so forth. Revelation chapter 22, here's the one warning about not adding to this book. It says this book, and it could be referring to just the book of Revelation, or if we're applying it to this book like the Holy Book, the Holy Bible, I think as we look at those other 5 sections, we can apply this to also the rest of the Bible, the inspired word, that the plagues will be added to those who do try to add to this book. And it does say, right, 14:12, that the patience of the saints is those who keep the commandments and the faith of the Messiah. So, yes, the commandments are important. Now, notice this, and my point number 7 is there's 5 locations in the Tanakh and 1 in the New Testament. That comes out to 6 locations, the number of man. A man likes to add and take away from his word, so be careful, we humans out here. Like I said, I've been guilty myself, and I'm not saying I'm perfect now, but hopefully each year we can get our walk a little bit more accurate and a little bit more faithful. And always remember the big Passover picture I want to leave with this video teaching. I call it the big Passover picture. The big picture? Observe it. Passover on the 14th day of the first month, okay? Either at the beginning of the 14th or in the late afternoon before sunset. Observe it. Either timing, and what I propose, same day, symbolizes the symbolisms that our Messiah did are not sinful. So, do them on the 14th. That's pretty clear. I think we can all agree on. And the 14th day Passover is good. Either earlier or later should not cause divisions or any upsets, uncomfortable people who don't want to fellowship with one another and be good brethren and family. Mishpacha, as we say in Hebrew. Observe the Passover every year as commanded on the 14th, the best you can and the best you know how. And there's years we just can't do it, right? Even you have to do it 30 days later. And there's provision for that. If you can't even do it properly, you can do it 30 days later in the Torah. Examine self, yourself. I got to examine myself thoroughly beforehand. Examine ourselves. Do we carry still religious baggage from our past? That's another area. Not only just sins, areas where we fall short on character flaws. But if you can't find anything, well, try examining, well, do I have any religious baggage, that I've been taught that I'm too stubborn with, that I need to change with. I've found that in myself, and hopefully I don't have any more, but I probably do. With a clean heart from inside, and a mind and a soul for the right reasons unto Him, examining ourselves with the right motives, not to try to be better than others or better than everybody else or to elevate ourselves, but all for Him. To do it, everything we do, including the Passover time period. We're commanded to celebrate His death in that time period. There's no commandment to celebrate the resurrection. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but to examine ourselves with as much unity, with as much humility as possible, with other sincere believers as possible too.